So I wanted to first stop and say thank you so much to the Navy League and Sea Air Space, not just for hosting this polar conversation, but also helping ensure that this remains an enduring topic for this community. So thank you very much. My name is Abby Tingstad. I am a research professor at the Center for Arctic Study and Policy at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the U.S. Coast Guard's only internal think tank, I'd invite you to join our LinkedIn site. We'd be glad to see you there in the conversations online. But for now, I have the privilege of introducing both our topic today and our panelists as well. So we continue to see and hear so much about the Arctic and Antarctic, about their vast economic possibilities, strategic access points and routes, their stark environments and changes, scientific endeavors and infrastructure challenges, and in the case of the Arctic, notable cultures and communities as well. Now, security, and specifically national security, is a thread woven within and between these themes, as these polar regions continue to be recognized not just for their strategic geography, but also as key for national security issues as well. The beginning of our panel's title, of course, is demanding presence in the poles. And a key component of presence, of course, is the ability to access the poles through various domains. But I would challenge us to think a little bit more about the fact that there could be a difference between access and presence. You know, I know that people say that showing up is, 70 or 80% of life, but I think we can interrogate that a little bit more and talk about what does it really mean to not just access, but have presence in the polar regions, and how does that link in with national security? So before we go further into our first series of questions, it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel here today. Immediately to my left is Vice Admiral Tom Allen, Acting Deputy Commandant of Operations at the U.S. Coast Guard. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Immediately followed by a warm welcome to Vice Admiral Angus Topshee, Commander, Royal Canadian Navy. Thank you for being with us as well, sir. And then moving on to Vice Admiral Doug Perry, U.S. Navy Second Fleet and Commander of Joint Force Command Norfolk. Thank you for being here, sir.
Good to be here, Abby.
And of course, rounding out our esteemed panel here, we're glad to welcome Mr. Ben Bordelon, the CEO and President of Bollinger Shipyards. Thank you all for being here. And now we'll get to the fun part and just start off with our questions. So let's first talk about, and perhaps you can start us off, Admiral Allen, about what it really means to have presence in these polar regions and not just access.
All right, so as you would think, Abby gave me the first question, so my staff wrote me a great one here. So I'm going to read this because I think it's important, and really I appreciate sharing a stage with this panel. I think as you go around today and see a lot of people talking, it's great to see the international perspective, the Navy perspective, and then the builder here, because I think that's how important the Arctic is and what we're doing. So I think access is a fundamental prerequisite to presence, and achieving assured access to the polar region is a tremendous challenge because the environment gets a vote, and sometimes that vote is a veto. Ice is the predominant factor, but other environmental extremes such as wind and fog also factor in, particularly for aviation assets. So having properly equipped vessels, trained crews, and most importantly, icebreakers is essential to giving the U.S. assured access to these critical areas. And I think, you know, in this day and age, we talk a lot about how are we doing domain awareness, how are we working things, and can we do that with remote monitoring? I always go to a mentor of mine who said, virtual presence is actual absence, right? And I think presence really does matter when you start talking about that. But access alone is not enough. To shape and influence the region, we need to convert access to presence. For that presence to be meaningful, we must perform our operational missions and exercise strategic leadership. Strategic leadership includes participation in international forums and partnerships, such as bilateral and multilateral exercises that enable us to develop partnerships and an Arctic-ready workforce to reinforce unity of effort and responsible Arctic governance. We are also active in international governments forums such as the Arctic Council work groups and their International Maritime Organization. These are critical venues and they enable us to advance our national objectives and those of like-minded partners and allies. From the U.S. Coast Guard operational perspective in the U.S. Arctic, presence is critical for border security and territorial integrity. And that's been a big piece of what we are doing. It enables us to observe, track, respond, and interdict activity. It also allows us to identify behavioral trends that we can incorporate into our operational planning so that we can be proactive in shaping the Arctic security environment rather than simply responding to it. For example, we need to ensure that vessels, both foreign and domestic, follow international rules. Presence allows us to enforce laws and hold violators accountable. With growing commercial activity and increasing Russian and Chinese operations in Arctic waters, we must meet presence with presence, or even better, meet presence with strength. If we aren't present, others will fill that void. Nations whose interests may not align with ours are our allies. Russia controls nearly half of the Arctic, and we're seeing increased cooperation between Russia and China in this space, from resource shipments to military operations. We must lead in the polar region. That means having the right capabilities, the right presence, and the right polar partnerships, both with Arctic and non-Arctic nations. If we fail to act, we'll be left on the sideline watching others shape the future of the region in ways that we cannot serve our natural interests. And I think as we start to talk about that and we start to talk about heavy polar security cutters, I think we're finally making great progress and look forward to addressing that as we move forward. Thanks, Abby.
Thank you so much. Admiral Topshee, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree. I mean, I can endorse just about everything we've just heard. For us, it begins with awareness before access, and that's really, Canada's made a substantial investment in domain awareness across the Arctic from space all the way down to the seabed. That's through the Arctic Over-the-Horizon Radar, Polar Over-the-Horizon Radar, a network of subsurface sensors designed to make sure we understand what's going on in that region. And then after that, the investment we've made in access to the region, on top of the capabilities we already had at forward operating locations for the Air Force in support of North American Aerospace Defense Command, across our Arctic region, we've added now 6 ice-breaking warships for the Canadian Navy, capable of breaking about 4.5 feet of ice, operating anywhere around the world, throughout the Arctic in the summer navigation season and anywhere around the Arctic year-round. And that is about assuring access to where we need to be. But the presence part is the key, as has been highlighted. And for that, it comes with, first of all, a persistence, of being able to be in the region, be fully understanding it. There's a physical component to that, being on the ground, on the ice, and being aware of all of that. And then the other part for us is recognizing that the Arctic is an incredibly sparsely populated and distant area for Canada. And so, as I frequently remind my political leadership in Canada, it is closer from Halifax, our East Coast base, across the entire Atlantic and into the Mediterranean. That's a shorter trip than up into our Arctic and visiting our high north, the north end of Baffin Island. And likewise, from West Coast, from Victoria to Tokyo, is a shorter trip than from Victoria through the Aleutians, the Bering Strait, into the Beaufort, and into the Canadian High North. So for us, it's necessarily an expeditionary theater, which means for that persistent presence, we require to work as a whole of society, not just whole of government. The peoples of the North are a key part of our understanding of that region, of our awareness of what's happening all of the time. And so we work very closely with territorial governments to make sure that we understand the challenges that they see. And the 3 Arctic premiers have indicated that they are quite concerned about the security challenges that they face, not just the impact of climate change, but the presence of potential adversaries in our north and the impact that they could have. And likewise, it's about making sure that we work with industry, where industry has a presence, that we can leverage that. Because when there's an economic value proposition to build a deep sea port to be able to extract some of the richest reserves of iron ore in the world, that's a great capability for us to have if we partner with industry effectively to ensure that we can access that location to help build that persistent presence that we think is essential to true sovereignty over our north. So we absolutely are committed. Awareness, assured access, and a persistent physical presence.
Thank you. It's interesting that you brought up that concept of persistence. Admiral Perry, do you want to pull the thread on that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to echo I think that Tom and Angus's comments, I would echo everything they've said. Persistence. So before I go to persistence, I'd say, why do we need to be there? Second Fleet was actually stood back up in 2018 in recognition of there are some real threats that come from the Arctic and through the Arctic. And those are Russian capabilities, very advanced submarines that they are continuing to produce, as well as long-range aviation. Now that, in some ways, is a return to the pattern of activity that was throughout the Cold War, where U.S. navies, allied navies, NATO navies were in not just the Atlantic, but in what I refer to as the High North. That's Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, and then up into the Arctic. And persistence, the ability to operate submarines, maritime patrol reconnaissance aircraft, fighter aircraft if they need to do an intercept, or Arctic patrol vessels, the Harry de Wolf, the Danes, the Norwegians also have those. The ability to operate up there when you need to be there is necessary to demonstrate that we can be there to respond, whether that's to an existential threat to the Euro-Atlantic, and that's European nations, NORAD, NORTHCOM, as a general North American, but the United States. And we've been doing that from a homeland defense perspective since the 1950s. But we're back to needing to be there with persistence today. So my view on what is required there is domain awareness, space assets help there, radar assets help there. That's both looking for what's in the air and looking for what's on the surface of the ocean, as well as when you can drive ships through. We need to be able to demonstrate to drive ships up there and operate in that environment. Arctic, High North, GIUK gap, there's significant differences, but the commonalities are it's usually bad weather, unless it's not. It's very challenging. Even if the weather is okay, you still have ice or marginal ice. Read that as there are icebergs floating around and they're hard to detect. And that not only affects the freedom of navigation, the ability to get around, access, but it's also the reliability of your sensors in that environment. And so up in the High North, the ability to have persistent sensing for domain awareness is really where I think we all should start. We do not endeavor to put ships up there 24 hours a day, 365 days a year in what I would call the Arctic Sea. But we need to be able to be there when we need to be there. But it would start with, for the defense of our collective across the Euro-Atlantic and certainly for the homeland, it starts with understanding what else is up there. And not only, I think to reference Tom's comments, is that a lot of other things are happening. So there's less and less sea ice. So there'll be more and more blue water every day of the year going forward. And so that demands that if we value international freedom of the seas, that's international rules-based order, if you will, then we actually have to be there and be present and have persistent presence to demonstrate that we will enforce international law, even in the face of maybe some illegitimate claims about someone owns a particular sea route because it happens to be near their coastline. Russia owns the largest coastline in the Arctic. Canada is second. United States might be third. It might be Norway. But today, going forward, we now have 7 of the 8 Arctic nations are in NATO, all of whom are thoroughly invested in Arctic security, and there are investments going into capabilities. I would say first and foremost, if we want to be persistently present on the Arctic, that does require vessels that can be there when they need to be there, whatever the demand is. With the less and less sea ice, it means that there are going to be more tourist vessels. There will be more research and more exploration for resources. There will be more fishing as those fish stocks actually go further and further north. And so we need to be there to preserve that, in addition to being prepared to defend our alliance and defend our homeland in the air, in the sea, down to the subsea, to the seabed. So, thanks.
Being there when you need to be there, I think That's a very interesting way of putting it. And so in a perfect way to transition to Mr. Bordelon, if you could take us through a little bit of maybe how industry views presence versus access and how to design a vessel, for example, to be there when you need to be there. What are the considerations?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me. Great to be on a panel with all these smart guys that definitely know a lot more about our navies and Coast Guard than I do. But here as industry, when I look at, what are we doing to support the needs, I think one big thing to point out, when you look at those words, presence and access, hopefully with that becomes predictability for a need. And, let's face it, for the last 50 some odd years, this has not been a tremendous focus in government contracting. And we've seen a switch in that now, which is great. You're seeing that not only here in the United States, but obviously in Canada and other areas. So we have a reinvigorated type market that we have. But when you look at access, that's a component. And you can always have a vessel that goes up there and can come back, but having a presence to me is a commitment, and those two are interchangeable to me. That you showing a commitment, a long-term commitment to do that. Contracting is a way to do that. Obviously, we have contracts here in the U.S. to build the heavies, as Admiral Allen talked about. But having that long-term commitment that's investing, and I'm going to talk from the U.S. side, the U.S. industrial base. Having U.S. built assets, U.S. mariners, working in conjunction with the Canadians and other allies, I think are great. But to revitalize and to rebuild our industrial base, having both, from the access side and the presence side, shows that commitment. We recently did some changes in our contract that I think set the tone and the platform for us to have great success in building for the U.S. Coast Guard. With the Friends in the Navy helping contract it, obviously. That's how we got there. But again, showing that long-term commitment, giving the industrial base here the ability to invest more into the facilities. Since we bought the Halter Yard that we're building the Polar Security Cutters at, we've spent well over $100 million of our own money. We're going to have a lot more invested in the next 3 years going forward. We're going to continue to invest in technologies and learn from different areas. But at the same time, I think it's important for everyone to know that, I hear sometimes where this hadn't been done in 50 years. So how are you doing with it? I made a joke the other day at one of my bankers' meeting that I had never built a rocket ship transporter before either. And we designed it and we executed and we built it. We're building a couple of different things that are first of class. This isn't a first of class that it's never been built in the history of the world. This is the first time that I think any first of class from a technological standpoint and lessons learned across the spectrum. And I'll say that, using outside, using internal resources, and having a ship that is a true first of class in today's world is very exciting. But at the end of the day, and I'm not trying to demean shipbuilding, trust me, those who are in this room knows it's hard. That's why I got a bunch of gray hair in the last couple of years. It is something, though, that, when you open and willing to find best technologies and utilize resources that you may have not used before, but spend the front time engineering, come up with the proper production plan. Essentially, you're putting together pieces, much bigger pieces, obviously, and much more critical in some degree. But at the same token, the U.S. shipbuilding industry, certainly, in my opinion, is very well positioned right now to take advantage of this. And really, it's been a growth that has really reared its head in the last, I'd say, 7 to 10 years of kind of globally. You've seen ships getting built all over the place. We mentioned China and other, the Russians, et cetera. But now there's a focus here, and I just want to be able to say that the U.S. shipbuilding industry is ready to tackle it.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you so much. So presence is a commitment. I would like to maybe pull on that thread a little bit further, maybe starting with you, Admiral Allen, if we can think about that a little bit in terms of the portfolio of capabilities that, we've already mentioned some of those here, talking about domain awareness and others, but I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about, icebreaking is certainly an important part of the conversation. What are the current priorities for the Polar Security Cutter program, and maybe what are some of the other capabilities that go along with that portfolio in a broader perspective?
Thanks for that question. So, as you talk about it, and you even look at what that footprint is that we're trying to lay down to make sure we have that presence when we need to have it and are able to operate there, we've been talking for a long time now about 8 to 9 vessels, with at least 3 of those being heavy and maybe additional Arctic security cutters, which we kind of say is that medium. It's been great to see the heavy icebreaker coming to life at Bollinger, Mississippi. Just as you went down there, the design is almost completely at I think we're at 95, 96%. You're looking modules being built. We're at that point where we're going to really start putting things together. And, just talk about an industrial base right now. I know we keep talking about it, and do we have the right people? I've been lucky enough to go down to Bollinger, Mississippi, and talk to those people that are building this. And they are proud that they're working in an industry that hasn't done this for 50 years, and they're figuring new ways to use different steel. They're figuring ways to build this, and they're figuring out how to do it in a time frame that's going to meet the operational needs that we have. So it's been very exciting. To your point, though, I think when you start to look at that, that's only half the problem, right? We've got to get up there. As you talked a little bit about it, the Arctic is a remote area, right? So we need to be able to refuel. We need to be able to bring in supplies. We need to be able to interact. And we need to be able to do exercises and work together to make sure that we're prepared. We talked a little bit about the cruise ships that are going through there. Other ships, we have to be ready for oil spills. We have to be ready for what we would call a large search and rescue case in case one of those cruise ships have going. And it all becomes part of the Arctic Council, the exercises where we're doing, the plans that we're making. And when you look at that, Polar security cutters, Arctic security cutters are only part of that. How do we communicate with each other? How do we increase domain awareness with some of our satellites and what we're working there? And how do we start to figure out what the right footprint is for facilities to have in those locations and do it? I think as we look at deep water ports up there and where we're operating, whether it's on the Alaska side or if we're talking along the East Coast, there's a lot of considerations and things we have to look at as we figure out how deep do we need those ports to be, what do we need to operate in and out of there, and how do we need to be able to support some of the things that DoD is doing for space and just mere presence. So I think there's a lot to that question, and I think we're only going to be able to do that with our partners. And when I say our partners, it's certainly within the U.S. and industry. It's certainly with our international partners, and it's great to kind of look out in the crowd and see so many international partners here that are up with this equal task. And then for us, within the United States, it's our tribal partners. They're up there, they've been working a long time, and we're learning lessons from them that we're being able to apply right now in how we do operations and what we look for.
And thank you. I realize that was a big question. I appreciate you taking the time to try to answer that in just a couple of minutes with that summary for us all. Another big question, I think, is how to build a very effective strategy. But even so, strategies are still paper, or were paper at one point at least. Now they're online, I suppose. But how to then take that strategy and then implement it in terms of a program of building a portfolio and other things. So I wanted to turn to Admiral Topshee and ask, Canada has been working on the Arctic and Offshore Patrol Ships program, and how does this really fit within the Arctic and Northern Strategic Framework, and what have the key opportunities been to work with partners?
Yeah, so for us, it was a recognition in Canada that while our Coast Guard has long had a presence in our Arctic, has worked in partnership with the U.S. Coast Guard, when we look at the full spectrum of sovereignty and security challenges in the North, we need to have the ability to respond across the full spectrum, and that involves potentially a Navy presence as well. I would argue that the Harry DeWolf class has been one of the most successful ships that we've introduced to the Royal Canadian Navy, because we've learned that a ship that was designed to go up into the North and break ice has incredible capability in other areas. We've had it off, actually, in fact, the original ship, Harry DeWolf, just got back from working with an embarked Coast Guard detachment in the Caribbean enforcing, looking for drugs, intercepted, I think, 750 kilograms of cocaine that was destined for the U.S., a successful interdiction and an arrest. So these ships have proven to be extremely capable. Where we find it really interesting is what we are able to do beyond the Navy. So we have, last year, in a darker moment in Canadian history, we forcibly relocated a number of communities across the Canadian Arctic that caused profound harm to those communities. This past year, we took some of those elders back to their original communities on one of our ships. An opportunity for those elders to go back to where they had grown up 50 years later to see that area, reconnect with their path, reconnect with their ancestors. And it was a really deep moment of us in establishing that connection with the people of the North, whose presence has long been a part of Canada. And then the other piece we've discovered is when you have a ship like that, to Doug's point, yes, we could keep it in the Arctic forever. I would probably have a lot fewer sailors, because after a little while up north, like you've seen a polar bear, you've seen the northern lights, you've realized a community of 150 people runs out of options for a port call fairly quickly. And they like to go other places, which is why going to the Caribbean and contributing to Martillo makes a lot of sense to us. And we took Margaret Brook and sent it to South America, to Antarctica this year, for two reasons. One, we wanted to really push the envelope with that ship and make sure that we've gotten used to what it takes to operate in the Arctic. What is different about operating in the Antarctic? What are the differences in terms of climate, sea conditions, navigation charts, all of the other things that go into operating in that very difficult part of the world? And then the second thing is we've been watching very closely what Russia and China have been doing in the Arctic. We wanted to go down firsthand and see what have they been doing down in Antarctica, and what is the difference there. And so we found it really useful to cooperate with our Chilean, Brazilian, Argentinian counterparts to see their experience. I had the chance to visit Antarctica and learned that the Chilean military's got a great presence on King George Island. But on one side of them are the Chinese and on the other side is the Russians. And you really get a sense of, okay, everybody's on top of each other down here. And so for us, it's been about taking advantage of a new platform for the Canadian Navy, operationalizing it in a variety of ways to make sure that we really have a full understanding of what is happening in the world across the full spectrum of security challenges, and what are we going to do about it in support, of Canadian interests and objectives.
And so, Mr. Bordelon, I think Admiral Topsy actually raised a really interesting point about, you build a vessel, and then you might use it in the Arctic or maybe also in the Antarctic to that point, and maybe for a variety of different things, drug interdiction along the way, and kind of getting those folks on the vessel, maybe port calls and someone somewhere a little larger than a village of 150, but when you design a vessel, I'm sure you have a set of missions in mind, but those could very well change in the decades hence. How do you handle that as industry?
That's challenging. I'll say it like that. Frankly speaking, we're the builder, as you mentioned. We're not the operator. So we have a customer that we deal with, and be it the Coast Guard or the Navy in this instance, and then you start kind of piling on top of that. What else can this thing do? And some of the challenges we run into, as well as the Coast Guard and the Navy, in my opinion, at what point do you just say stop? Pencils down. We don't need any more scientists on board. We don't need any more people on board. When you're looking from a commercial standpoint compared to a government standpoint, it's completely different. Building a government contract is way more cumbersome. Actually, my grandfather recommended against that very quickly. And here I'm sitting on stage doing government work. But he said you become fat and inefficient at building for the government. And I'm saying that tongue-in-cheek a little bit. But understanding the government processes is a lot different. And it is challenging because you do have a lot of different inputs going in to some degree of what needs to be on the ship. We can go as far as making recommendations, but at the end of the day, they are the customer. So some of the delay in churn that we have, and I'm not trying to tell on anyone, it's just a fact of how it works. Certainly, it creates a little more cumbersome approach with us to try to get a ship designed that meets everybody's, ideas. And, some of the things that we try to push back on is a little realism of, well, this is going to delay it, this is going to add more cost, et cetera. So that's some of the challenges we do. Interjecting new technologies is always challenging. Frankly, it's easy on the commercial side. They're a lot more nimble in making changes up front. A design process in the government world might be, depending on the program, 5 to 8 years or longer. And on the commercial side, you might be 6 months to a year because you're making more immediate type decisions. And I think there's been discussions about trying to commercialize more things. I do think we can learn a lot from the commercial markets and interject that into government contracting. But it is challenging, and it creates a team of folks to manage through that. But depending on the type of vessel, I think it's more necessary than in some other vessels. I think you can commercialize more. But again, it's a evolving process that frankly has been getting more attention lately. I think everybody in this room knows it. And we all getting questions on what can we do to make it more efficient and better. And some of that's going to be, just speaking frankly, is you may not meet 100% of the needs of what everybody thinks you need. And I use the word think because a lot of the people saying that, sorry, they don't really 100% know that that's what we need. And at the expense of potential losing programs because of cost and delays, what's the trade-off? If I get 85% of my ship designed, but I get a program that's fully funded, cheaper and faster, I think there needs to be some more discussion on that. And hopefully in today's environment, we'll have some momentum to get that done. Because at the end of the day, I can promise you, the shipyards and industrial base, all we want to do is build more and employ people. And having predictability in programs obviously gives us that. But at the end of the day, if there's a choke point or a gag point of cost, what can we do to manage that? And some of that is going to be design requirements. And what do we expect out of the ships?
Thank you. That sounds like a lot of juggling. I appreciate the window into that very much. Speaking of juggling needs, Admiral Perry, you mentioned earlier that there are a lot of differences depending on where you're operating. And so, in fact, some practitioners talk about there being many Arctics. And even if we think about the 2 poles, those are very different as well. We've heard a little bit about that too from Admiral Topshee as well. I'm wondering if you can take us through a little bit more, maybe even comparing the 2 hats that you wear. What are some of the main differences and commonalities that you see in your various areas of responsibility?
Yeah, sure. So Second Fleet, as I mentioned, was stood back up in 2018 as a maritime homeland defense numbered fleet command in the United States. And that was in recognition of behaviors of Russia, of what was happening with the annexation of Crimea, and then the capability delivery of a Severodvinsk-class submarine. Very capable. And those capabilities come from the high north. They come from the Kola Peninsula up in Murmansk. And so my charge as Second Fleet is to defend the homeland in the maritime, west of 45 West, in the Western Atlantic. And that's the geography that I own, working for my boss, who's Admiral Darrell Caudle, Nav North, who works for General Geo Northcom. But that's a maritime homeland defense. I do that under a Maritime Command Element East. And actually right now, under Maritime Command Element East, I have USS Gravely deployed in the Gulf of America. And that's a different approach to the United States, but it is a defense of the homeland. So that's there, but overlapping that, like literally on top, from including the Gulf of America down to the Tropic of Cancer, and then the entirety of the Atlantic between the west coast of Europe to the east coast of the United States, all the way to the North Pole. So, including Greenland, and then out to the North Cape of Norway. That's my geography in JFC Norfolk, Joint Force Command Norfolk. And Joint Force Command Norfolk is one of 3. You might think of them as mini combatant commanders in the U.S. context, but 3 regional commanders that comprise Allied command operations of NATO. But that's about 80% of the NATO geography. Most of it is water, but it includes right now Norway, Greenland, the UK, and Iceland in terms of land masses. And once we get the full interim operating capability or limited mission capability later this year, we'll bring on Finland, Sweden, and Denmark into our geography. So our geography will extend into the Baltic Sea. So that's overlapping, but principally in mission context, my job, almost the verbiage reads almost exactly the same, and that is deter potential adversaries and, if necessary, defeat potential adversaries, to defend the homeland and provide for the collective defense of NATO. Well, that's kind of merging those two. My geography is Second Fleet, is the western side of the Atlantic, but I can also work as United States Second Fleet. I can work for Admiral Stu Munch, who is Naval Forces Europe, to command forces all the way across the Atlantic if we get into a fight and he needs another fleet commander to work for him, because if those of you who know Marvin Anderson, commander of the United States Sixth Fleet, he could be busy. He's got a pretty intense geography owning the Baltic Sea as Sixth Fleet and the Mediterranean, and there's a lot of things going on there as well. Defense of Israel, they got the Black Sea, and so those are the overlapping geographies. But fundamentally, as it relates to the Arctic and the high north, it's about preventing strategic assets or strike assets that could be brought to bear against the homeland, the United States, NORAD North America, NORAD Northcom, or even the European states inside NATO, from those strike assets getting out of the Arctic, out of the high north, where they have freedom of maneuver in the Atlantic. And from a tactical perspective, it's pretty difficult to really counter those threats, those capabilities, if they get out of the high north. So we collectively, allies and partners, they all contribute to that defense of North America and the NATO nations, the Euro-Atlantic. That's a little bit of a comparison, but principally it's the same thing, just one is maritime and the other is multi-domain, from the seabed to space, joint, and I'm able to leverage those nations. I see many of them here, Norway, Finland, Sweden, some of them shipbuilders that work with ours. And you mentioned the AOPVs. Denmark, Norway, Canada, all operate these AOPVs. Oh, by the way, I think much of their construction is to commercial standards, which helps them deliver those sooner, faster. How do we do that? We exercise together all the time. Angus Topshie and myself, we go forward up into the high north under Operation Op Nanook. That's U.S. destroyers, Harry de Wolf class AOPV, going forward with the Dutch spring vessels. Will operate between Greenland up in the high north. And then in the NATO context, last year in Steadfast Defender, also coupled with the Norwegian national exercise, Nordic Response, we had 20,000 sailors, airmen, soldiers with amphibious capabilities from Italy, right? That's Italy sending amphibs up to Norway to go ashore with really good capabilities. The French doing the same thing, Canada, the United States. Charlottetown was out there doing that before she conducted a NATO deployment. And we had hundreds of aircraft, ground vehicles, and about 50 ships. That was a collective defense of the NATO, and we demonstrated in that very tough Arctic environment how to do amphibious operations, how to do anti-submarine warfare. So we work with our allies and partners with whatever capabilities we have that's on the shelf to really define what's needed in the future, but we have to exercise every day. So, thanks.
Well, thank you for also raising that issue of geography. I mean, we're not just necessarily talking about just the Arctic in quotations, which is quite a geography of its own, but then also the approaches and the various connections that there might be depending on the organizations. So I'd actually like to pose my next question, perhaps first to Admiral Topshie and then to Admiral Allen. Thinking through this geography a bit more, which both the Canada and the US obviously deal with a lot, Arctic and Antarctic. And taking forward maybe a phrase that I'm borrowing from Mr. Bordelon here, the predictability for a need. So we heard a bit about that from the industry perspective, but from an operator's perspective, what are your thoughts on taking this big geography and finding a way to organize capabilities and people and training, to your point, Admiral Perry, in order to provide some predictability for a need should it arise? So maybe over to you first, Admiral Topshie.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that navies and coast guards bring is a great flexibility. You know, ships are inherently very flexible, can be reconfigured, retasked to do a variety of different things. And so nowhere in the statement of requirements, going back to Ben's point, did it say the Harry DeWolf class had to be able to embark 15 scientists and do Antarctic science. But it proved to be extremely successful at doing that because we deliberately built it with the flexibility to embark different sea containers, to have an embarked forces mess, to have a lot of flexibility and accommodations of who could go on board, and different areas that were reconfigurable to support the scientific mission of that ship once it entered Antarctic waters. And I think that was a really good exercise for us in the Navy to learn how to work with a very non-traditional group for us, to interact with navies that while we've operated with them, it's often been more up in the Caribbean, around Central America, rather than all the way down south, truly into their part of the world. And so I think that, forcing function of understanding how to work in a different part of the world. And then I think in going down and talking to the scientists, I didn't realize how much we could learn to validate what we were observing in the Arctic from what we were seeing in the Antarctic. And also, what are the differences in those two environments? And in some cases, the pace of climate change is faster in the Arctic, and in some cases, it's faster in the Antarctic. There are some potential solutions and options that might be found in either location. And so for us, it was really about making sure that we take advantage of the inherent flexibility of Naval and Coast Guard assets to build relationships that can enhance national security across that whole spectrum of security.
Thank you. Admiral Allen?
I'd just add a couple things. I mean, that's a great answer, but when you look at it and you look at all the areas we got to operate, so right now we have the Polar Star. It's our only heavy icebreaker. It was built in the early 1970s. She's getting old, and we're still putting her through a lot of ice each year. But we send her down to McMurdo every year to do that breakout to make sure that our National Science Foundation is able to do the missions and continue the presence in Antarctica that we need, because we think that's a vital area that is under treaty, and we need to maintain that presence as we watch other people who are doing things down there that I think presence matters and how you monitor and what you look at. As you go up into the Arctic, we've been using the Coast Guard cutter Healy, which has had a long, distinguished career. It's gone through the Northwest Passage. It's operated successfully, just went back to the North Pole. It's doing a lot there. But we're still trying to learn, and we don't think we have the capacity. So while we wait for those polar security cutters, this year we went and we bought the Coast Guard, I'm going to say it's Coast Guard cutter Storis. That was the IVIC that was successfully operated in the Arctic and on Antarctic. Wasn't built to quite the Coast Guard specifications that we would say, hey, we got to have. But the Coast Guard's learning. We're learning that this provides a lot of capability. It provides a lot of ability. And so we're taking that up into the Arctic this summer to basically see how we can use that ship and what we can do to increase presence. It's not going to have everything we want, but I will tell you, the crews that are getting on it, they like that ship. Right? They really like that ship. I preserved at my level the ability to say who gets on it and who doesn't get on it this summer, because I think we have every senior Coast Guard officer in the world that wants to get on there, along with every engineer. So we're looking at those new models to understand how we build that presence up in the Arctic, how we meet those important missions, how we continue to operate with other Arctic nations and fulfill those interests. So.
Okay, well, thank you for those examples of innovation and flexibility, which always seems like a good thing when it comes to the polar regions. Mr. Bordelon, last question before we go to the audience for some additional questions. I think I'll pose to you. You've already raised the fact that your family has been in this business for multiple generations and had different perspectives along the way. I'm curious, as we do this, I was going to say groundbreaking, but I'll say ice-breaking. I'm known for my bad puns. Sorry, everyone. I thought I was going to get through this without doing one of those. But from your multi-generational perspective, how does revitalizing the ability to build ice-breaking vessels in the United States factor into the broader evolution of the industry itself?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think back to when my grandfather started. I think he would be a little shocked I'd be sitting on this panel talking about building heavy icebreakers. He started on Baie Lafourche, which is 9.5 feet of water, and we can't build an icebreaker in Lockport. The draft just doesn't work. But it has been an evolution, and I mentioned, some of this earlier. Is technologies, be it in welding or in engineering or, C4, C5I stuff, all of that stuff has continued to evolve. There's no doubt. Technology has certainly played a big role in not just the Arctic, I would say in general, just across the board in shipbuilding as well as in our lives. AI is happening right in front of us. My kids still call me a dinosaur and some stuff, but so pulling all of that together is big. Having lessons learned is huge. Admiral Allen mentioned the IVIC. The IVIC's a good example. That ship was built in 2013, 2014 time period from a sister company of ours. That was built in 3 years. Great example of commercial build. It is the fanciest ship in the Coast Guard, Admiral, because it is under commercial terms. They have fancy floors in there and nice ceilings and pretty glass work. But back to the point of having that mix of commercial and government contracting, I think is the next big step that we're going to see going forward. And utilizing, some of the things that we've learned here domestically as well as foreign. Talking with other successful programs in engineering, things like that you can add value. But the U.S. shipbuilding has built a lot of commercial ships for a long time. It's been decimated lately, I'd say, over the last 50 years. Frankly, not because it's our fault. We're going on 80 years being in business, and I've done a lot of acquisitions, most of them because it's been poorly managed, poorly owned shipyards, and some of it is not just that. Some of it is just the industry was not there to support it. So I get back to the demand, and if you show the demand and you have the commitment, you're going to have investment. There's no question. We're dealing with a lot of different challenges right now. Tariffs is the hot word. If you put on TV right now, that's a hot word. That's all of the things we go through. I don't freak out over that because there's always seems to be something. There's always going to be something. We had, COVID when I was up here a while back. We were dealing with that. We went through inflationary times. We had markets crash in 2008. And now I feel very positive as a U.S. shipbuilder. And I would say global. We have some other folks in here that are building globally. It's nice to see shipbuilding be at the forefront and a push and the significance of the importance of what we're doing, I think is finally being acknowledged by folks and actually getting funding. So it's always the challenge of the whole geopolitical discussion is if you understand it, please tell me. But we are up here for a reason. And part of industry's job is to help get the money to support the programs of these gentlemen up here to build the fleets that we need to protect our nations.
Well, thank you very much. And I think it's time for a few audience questions. We actually have the pleasure of having a few of our future U.S. Coast Guard leaders in the room who will help us with the mics. The way we'll do this is we will take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then we'll invite the panel to kind of address the various points which they feel that they can address for you as the audience. All right, I already see a hand raised, a few hands raised actually. Do we have the mics out? Perfect.
Can't see through that bright light.
All right, if you don't mind standing up and introducing yourself and then asking your brief question. Thank you very much.
Sure, thanks for doing this. I'm Lee Farron with Breaking Defense. This is a question for Admiral Allen. A few weeks ago, President Trump mentioned buying 40 big icebreakers for the Coast Guard. I wonder if you could tell us what that's in reference to, what the status of that is, and any conversations you've had with the White House.
Thank you. Perhaps we can just take a couple more, and then we'll go for that. Okay, yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Eric Tegler for the War Zone. My question is whether the Coast Guard views the Polar Security Cutter principally as an icebreaker. Yes, it's got to do that. But is it a sensor platform? Is it a power projection platform? Is it a SAR platform? What are the capabilities that are most important to the Coast Guard?
Thank you very much. And we'll take one more before we start with some answers.
For you again.
I know, right?
Quite a few for you, Admiral Allen.
Hello, Keith Blevins, OpNav N2, N6. Similar to the question from Breaking Defense, There's a need and demand from both the past and present administration for more icebreakers. Talk about 40 icebreakers, which is a realistic number if you count our icebreaking tugs and smaller icebreakers. And we have a proven NATO design that Canada has made, as well as Norway, with their Harry de Wolf class. And that would give us a lot of great interoperability and enhanced acceleration for a shipyard to go with a design like that. In 2024, there was the Ice Pact signed between the US, Canada, and Finland. And where do you see your role as both Canada and the US here and the shipbuilder to act as part of the Ice Pact to build the new Arctic security cutter?
Thank you very much. Perhaps we can start with you, Admiral Allen, since you've got a bit of a tall order there. But then it would be great to hear from everyone about Ice Pact and anything else that came up for you in those questions.
Hey, so thank you for the question on the 40 icebreakers. You know what? Whenever your boss is interested in 40 icebreakers, you are very happy, right? I mean, this has been something that we've been trying to do for a long time. I will tell you that when you look at what the strategic studies have said for the Coast Guard, I kind of go back to that 8 or 9, right? 8 or 9 big, heavy icebreakers, at least 3 of them in that role. But as you just talked about, once you start looking at, hey, we think 2 Great Lakes icebreakers up there. We only have 1 now. When you look at how we're using our 225s and our 175s, as they look, as they go throughout the Northeast, up in the Hudson, up into Maine, how are we using those? Some of our smaller icebreakers on the Great Lakes, the 140s that work out of not only Great Lakes, but out of New York. Boy, you get up to that 40 number pretty quick because that's what we need, we think, to make sure that domestic operations continue and that we are poised to have that presence in the Arctic and Antarctic. So one, I just say it's very exciting to see your boss pointing towards a vision that we've had for a long time. So that's one thing. And then the capabilities, or what are we trying to do with polar security cutters? That's a great question. I think when you start talking about heavy icebreakers, that's a pretty easy, I wouldn't say a pretty easy vessel to build, but that's got a single mission. We went to industry and we said, oh yeah, we also need them so we can do boardings. Oh, we might be able to land helos on them. We got to do science missions. We got to do power projection, as you talked about. We got to be able to operate in the Antarctic and Arctic. And oh, by the way, there's much different seas as you go down to the Antarctic as what we're doing. So I would love to tell you that anything we buy in the Coast Guard has one mission. We have 11 missions, and what we always try to do is have smart people like Ben put all 11 missions into one cutter, and then he comes back and says, I can't do it all, and we negotiate from there. But I think it's a lot more than just breaking ice, that's for sure.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment?
Well, I will simply say that we're really pleased with what we've achieved with the Harry de Wolf class. That design was also bought by Chile and built as one of the first ships that they built for the Chilean Navy in Chile, the Fiel. It's proven quite successful. And to the comment about commercial standards versus civilian standards, so it is largely a commercial standard ship. When we looked at the first one, we realized, okay, that might have gone a little bit too far, so we ripped out some of the creature comforts, like the wood paneling, to make it more in line with that. It is still considered to be the most comfortable ship in the Royal Canadian Navy. Once a sailor is assigned, they're really hard to get them off of that back into one of our older frigates or a submarine. But it offers a great capability. And interestingly, we're now building 2 of them for our Coast Guard. Slight variation, so largely a common design, but with more Coast Guard, getting back to roles and missions. A lot more of that scientific research, over-the-side capability. And they've put back some of those creature comforts. So I look forward to seeing what that ship looks like when it comes out. But fundamentally, we know now, like, if we're serious about having a Navy, you have to have sailors who are engaged and involved, which means we need to take care of creature comforts. Building a shipbuilding industry is a prized thing overall because it means we're able to work with the shipbuilders in Canada to deliver what we really need. And fundamentally, back to the question about roles and missions of a polar security cutter, ships can do a phenomenal number of things. And so there is an inherent flexibility there that I have tried to get our team, back in Canada to stop fussing about whether or not it can do everything we think it can do. Because by the time it's delivered, and especially over the 25 to 30-year life of that ship, it will do all sorts of things we never imagined. And because of the incredible innovation and initiative of our sailors, it will do them surprisingly well. So for me, it's get the ships out there, and then we'll do great things with them.
Great point.
Yeah.
I would harken back to the title of the panel here, and that's how a good Arctic strategy is part of national security. 90%, if not 99.9, hopefully 100% of what we do will be peacetime missions in the Arctic. But we have to be able to be there. I think fundamentally, from a shipbuilding perspective, it has to be able to operate in the Arctic, period. I do not think power projection, is that one of your stated missions? Yeah. So, but it has to be able to operate there. Yeah. And I've been on the Norwegian, the Canadian, the Danish AOPVs. And the modularity that Angus spoke of, we're going to leverage that in an upcoming Op Nanook to do a critical undersea infrastructure, mission thread. Get a van, a Connex van out there that can support autonomous undersea vehicles or ROVs with a diving unit. And that's not part of the mission set. It wasn't when it was stated. However, what we've learned is that, we've got destabilizing activity or hybrid activity being executed by potential adversaries, peer competitors who can threaten our homelands that we need to actually counter. And so presence with all the cables that exist in the Arctic, to Iceland, to Svalbard, through the North Sea, across the Atlantic, we have to, as nations, go out and protect those things. That's actually not a U.S. Navy mission per se. It's a private company mission, right? Because they own the cables typically. But when it goes through our territorial seas, well, if someone threatens it or does actually break it purposely or not, it might actually be a crime, if you will. So in order for us to demonstrate and preserve our national security, part of that critical undersea infrastructure, 90% of our data transactions, financial transactions of trillions of dollars a day go on these undersea cables, right? You got to be able to protect that. So I view, what we ought to be looking at for the Arctic is first, as we work to, lift up our shipbuilding, get the ships built fundamentally that can go to the Arctic. And then we can advance as we learn more and more. I'm not trying to shape the contract here, but I would like to shape the outcome, which is get ships to the Coast Guard as soon as possible. And I've been on these vessels. I've been in Alta, Norway, like literally the high north, on board the Norwegian one, and it's ready to go. It operates there throughout the year. And I think we can learn a lot out operating with our allies and partners, with the domain awareness that we need in peacetime. Most of that stuff will set us up to be able to deter a potential adversary. And like I said, most of what they would be pointing at North America with is going to come at us from the Arctic across the Arctic. So.
Well, if I can just wrap up here with one last question, maybe starting with Mr. Bordelon this time. One priority for ensuring that all of the partners can work more efficiently, effectively, whatever the word is, in the future. And
partners being who?
Interpret that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I think if you're referencing like lessons learned and what are the Canadians learning right now? They're in a build program. What have the Finnish learned? I mean, I could kind of go through a list of folks. I heard a comment about should we agree on a common design, a NATO type design. As a shipbuilder, I'm gonna say sure. I would love to see who's gonna quarterback and referee that fight. Who has the best one and all of that. So I do think collaboration is important. I think lessons learned of building is important. I think we have to, which includes a lot of different things. Technology is one, producibility is, obviously another one. Workforce development, what have other people done that have had success in workforce development, I think is a big part of that. And just predictable funding that you can get investment to come in. And how do we harness that? IcePack was mentioned. I'm a part of the IcePack. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure what that means all the time. I think we need to keep evolving that to a degree that we start getting some benefit from it. But the more we can share going forward, even during build programs, there needs to be some cooperation there. Some of the restrictions that have existed in the past from a security standpoint are now being talked about. There is some limitations that exist. I can't just allow anybody in my shipyard, as you can imagine. Some of that stuff is being evolved and worked through, but I think the more we can collaborate while not losing focus of building our industrial base here in the U.S. Is absolutely critical.
Well, thank you. Collaboration is a great way to end this conversation. Thanks so much for being on this panel, and thank you to our wonderful audience as well.
Thank you, sir.